They tore my $15,000 dress in front of 500 people while I was 7 months pregnant. My husband smiled. His mistress laughed. The video went viral with 20 million views. Everyone called me crazy, unstable, a gold digger who deserved it. But what they didn't know, I was recording everything. And the man who humiliated me had stolen $50 million using my dead father's company. This is the story of how I went from broken and homeless to destroying a criminal empire, taking back everything he stole, and proving that the most dangerous woman in the room is the one everyone underestimates. If you love stories about justice and revenge, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss how this ends. Let's begin. They ripped my $15,000 gown in front of 500 people. My husband held the champagne. His mistress held the scissors. But what they didn't know, I was recording everything. And I was 7 months pregnant with the heir to his empire. My name is Victoria Bennett. Everyone calls me Tori. 31 years old, fashion designer, and until tonight, the invisible wife of Manhattan's Golden Boy CEO. Let me rewind 12 hours. That morning, I stood in our penthouse bathroom, smoothing down the white silk gown I'd spent 3 weeks designing. My reflection showed a woman who still believed in fairy tales. Dark hair in soft waves, minimal makeup. The dress hugged my pregnant belly like a promise. "You look radiant," I whispered to myself, practicing gratitude like my therapist taught me. Garrett Hayes, my husband of 6 years, walked past the bathroom without looking, his phone pressed to his ear, designer suit sharp enough to cut. "No, tell the board I'll handle the Bennett contracts personally. Yes, all of them." Bennett, my maiden name, my late father's legacy. He ended the call and finally glanced at me. "Ready for tonight?" "It's my birthday," I said softly. "Our night." Something flickered across his face, a pity non-bound. It vanished before I could name it. "Right, your night. The gala's at 8. Don't want to be late." He left without kissing me. I should have known then. But when you love someone, you paint over the red flags until everything looks pink. The grand ballroom of the Empire Hotel glittered like a cathedral made of money. Crystal chandeliers, ice sculptures, Manhattan's elite in custom couture. This party was supposed to celebrate me, but I felt like a ghost haunting my own event. Garrett stood on stage, microphone in hand, his smile bright and empty. "Everyone, thank you for coming tonight to celebrate someone very special." My heart lifted. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe he still cared. My wife, Victoria, has been my foundation for 6 years. The woman who sacrificed her career, her identity, everything to support Hayes Luxury Atelier. Applause rippled through the crowd. I smiled, walking toward the stage. Then the ballroom doors opened. She appeared like something from a nightmare dressed in red. Scarlett Rose, 26 years old, Instagram model with 2 million followers. Legs for days, hair like spilled honey, and wearing, I noticed with growing horror, the exact dress from my private sketchbook, the design I'd hidden in my studio, the one I'd planned to debut next season. Scarlett glided to the stage, her hands sliding into Garrett's like they'd rehearsed this. "But tonight, Abano," Garrett continued, his voice dropping into something intimate, "I want to honor someone who truly inspires me, our company's new face and the woman who changed everything." He pulled Scarlett close, kissed her cheek. The cameras exploded with light. I stood frozen, my bouquet slipping from trembling hands. The baby kicked hard against my ribs, as if trying to warn me. "Run, run now." "Garrett," I whispered, "what are you doing?" Scarlett turned toward me, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Oh, honey, don't look so surprised. You were always just the warm-up act." She stepped down from the stage, walked straight toward me. The crowd parted like water. I saw it happening, couldn't process it fast enough to move. Her perfectly manicured hand reached for my shoulder strap. Yanked. The silk tore from neck to waist with a sound like a scream. Gasps filled the room. Someone laughed. Someone else raised their phone. I stood there, 7 months pregnant, clutching torn fabric against my chest while 500 people watched. My white dress hung in ruins, my belly exposed, my humiliation complete. Garrett's voice boomed from the speakers, mock sympathy dripping like poison. "My wife's been under a lot of stress lately. Hormones, you know how it is. Uneasy laughter, understanding nods. They believed him. I felt the room tilt. My knees buckled. The marble floor rushed up to meet me, and the last thing I heard before darkness claimed me was Scarlett's cold whisper near my ear. Happy birthday, darling. When awareness returned, I was staring at fluorescent lights. Hospital. The antiseptic smell burned my nose. Machines beeped steady rhythms beside me. My hands flew to my belly. Still round, still moving. Baby's okay, a woman's voice said. Dr. Carolyn Marsh stood beside my bed, her face professionally neutral, but her eyes soft with pity. You had a severe panic response. Blood pressure spiked dangerously. You almost miscarried. Victoria, almost. The word hung in the air like a knife. Where's Garrett? My voice cracked. Dr. Marsh hesitated. He called, said he's handling the press situation. He sent someone from his legal team. Not he sent love, not he's on his way. He sent lawyers. A nurse appeared with an envelope. Plain manila, official looking. Inside were divorce papers. I read the header 3 times before my brain accepted it. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Filed that morning, hours before the gala, before he destroyed me in public. He'd already erased me in private. Attached was a settlement offer. $50,000. Sign now. Leave quietly. Receive payment within 30 days. My father's company had been worth $50 million. The hospital room walls pressed closer. I checked my phone with shaking hands. 23 missed calls, 67 text messages. None from Garrett, but hundreds from strangers. I opened social media and watched my life become entertainment. The video had gone viral. 20 million views in 6 hours. Crazy designer's meltdown. The comments were knives. She looks unhinged. Gold digger got exposed. That mistress is gorgeous, though. Husband upgraded for sure. But my best friend Madison Cole had shared it with the caption, sometimes love means letting go. Praying for everyone involved. 300,000 likes. Madison, who'd held my hand through my father's funeral, who'd been my maid of honor, who'd promised we were sisters forever. She'd monetize my destruction. I tried to call her anyway, desperate for any ally. She answered on the first ring. Tori, oh my God, I saw everything. Are you okay? Madison, I need help. Garrett filed for divorce. They're trying to say I'm unstable. I need somewhere to stay. I need, honey. Her voice shifted, became careful, distant. Maybe this is for the best. You've been so stressed. Maybe you should focus on getting healthy first for the baby. My blood went cold. You think I'm crazy too? I think you need professional help. Garrett's worried about you. We all are. Professional help. The same phrase from his speech. They'd coordinated. You sent him the video, I said slowly. You filmed me collapsing and you sent it to him. Silence, then quieter. He paid me $20,000, Tori. I have student loans. You'd understand if you weren't so emotional right now. She hung up. I sat in that hospital bed, alone, watching my bank account on my phone, checking account frozen, savings account frozen, joint accounts emptied. My father had left me half of his fashion empire when he died. Garrett had promised to honor that legacy, build it together. I pulled up the company documents on my phone, searched for my name in the ownership papers. Nothing. Every file had been altered. My signatures forged. My inheritance erased. The machines beside me started beeping faster. Dr. Marsh returned, concerned. Victoria, your blood pressure? I need a lawyer, I whispered. Please, I need help. She hesitated, then wrote something on a prescription pad, tore it off, handed it to me. Not a prescription, a name and number. Blake Sullivan, attorney at law. Below it, in her handwriting, he doesn't lose. That night, discharged from the hospital with nowhere to go, I stood outside the building and borrowed scrubs. My white dress had been thrown away. My phone buzzed with another notification. Garrett Hayes announces separation, asks for privacy during difficult time. The article painted me as unstable, mentioned my father's death, suggested I'd never recovered, implied the pregnancy was a desperate attempt to trap a man who'd outgrown me. They'd taken everything. My marriage, my money. my reputation, my designs. But they'd made one mistake. They'd left me alive, and I was done being the victim in someone else's story. Blake Sullivan's office was in Brooklyn, 3 subway stops from anything resembling Manhattan glamour. The building was old brick, the kind with character instead of a doorman. His practice operated from the 2nd floor, above a bodega that sold the best coffee I'd ever tasted. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on my belly, the other clutching the paper Dr. Marsh had given me. Each step felt like walking toward either salvation or another humiliation. The door read Sullivan and Associates in simple gold letters. I knocked. "It's open?" a voice called. Inside, the office was organized chaos, law books stacked on every surface, case files in neat piles, a desk buried under work, and behind it, a man who looked nothing like the corporate sharks Garrett employed. Blake Sullivan was maybe 38, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples and eyes that assessed you without judgment. He wore jeans and a button-down with the sleeves rolled up. No tie, no armor. "Victoria Bennett," he asked, standing. "Hayes," I corrected automatically, then stopped. "Actually, no. Bennett, I'm taking it back." His mouth curved slightly. "Good. Sit. Want coffee? Wait, you're pregnant. Tea water." "Answers," I said. "I want answers about how my husband stole my life." Blake gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Dr. Marsh called ahead, told me the basics. Before we go further, I need to be honest with you. I don't work for people like your husband. I work for people he usually destroys. Then we want the same thing." He opened a legal pad, clicked a pen. "Tell me everything. Start with your father." So I did. Told him about Richard Bennett, fashion designer who built an empire from nothing, how he died 3 years ago, massive heart attack at 59, how his will split Bennett Designs 50-50 between me and Garrett, his son-in-law and chosen successor. "Except," I said, pulling up documents on my phone, "when I checked tonight, my name's been removed from everything. Every contract, every filing. It's like I never existed." Blake took my phone, studied the documents. His jaw tightened. "These signatures are forged. Badly. He didn't even try to hide it. Can you prove that?" "In court, maybe, but first we need to understand what we're fighting." He turned his laptop toward me. "I did some preliminary research after Dr. Marsh called. Hayes Luxury Atelier reported $52 million in revenue last year. Your father's original company was worth approximately $47 million when he died." The numbers made my head spin. "I don't want his money. I want what's mine." "It's the same thing, Victoria. He didn't just steal your marriage. He stole your inheritance and built his empire on top of it." Blake spent the next hour walking me through what he'd found. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands, transfers to offshore accounts, my designs copyrighted under Garrett's name, every piece of my father's legacy systematically erased and rebranded. "How long has he been planning this?" I asked. "Based on these filings, since about 6 months after you got married." 6 months. We'd still been in the honeymoon phase. I'd still believed in us. "There's more," Blake said carefully. "I pulled Scarlett Rose's background. She's not just a model. She worked for your husband's marketing firm 2 years ago. This relationship isn't new. Victoria, it's calculated." The baby kicked hard, as if angry on my behalf. Blake noticed me wince. "When are you due?" 10 weeks. Maybe less, after tonight's stress." He nodded slowly. "We need to move carefully. Garrett will use the pregnancy against you, paint you as emotionally unstable, claim you're unfit. We need to build an airtight case before we strike." "How long will that take?" "Months, maybe 6. Financial fraud cases move slowly." 6 months. I'd be recovering from childbirth, vulnerable, alone. "I don't have months," I said. "I don't have money for rent, or food, or, Winston." "You can stay here," Blake interrupted. "I have a guest room upstairs, small but clean. No charge until we win." I stared at him. "Why would you do that?" His expression darkened. "Because 5 years ago, a man like your husband destroyed my sister, took her business, her savings, her confidence. She didn't survive it." He paused. "So yeah, I have a vested interest in making sure you do." Something in his voice told me not to ask more. "Not yet." Okay, I whispered. Where do we start? Blake pulled out a fresh legal pad. We start by documenting everything. Every design you created, every contribution you made, every conversation, every email, every text message. We build a timeline that proves you were the creative force behind Hayes Atelier, not just the wife. For hours, we worked. I pulled up old photos from my phone, sketches I'd saved in cloud storage that Garrett hadn't found yet, text messages where I'd sent him ideas and he'd replied with praise, evidence of a partnership he was now denying it existed. Around midnight, Blake ordered takeout. We ate Chinese food surrounded by papers, building my case piece by piece. There's something else, I said between bites. At the gala, Scarlett was wearing one of my unreleased designs, a dress I sketched 3 weeks ago in my private studio. Garrett's the only person with access to that space. Blake's pen stopped moving. He's still stealing from you, even now. Can we use that? Maybe, if we can prove you created it first. He made a note. Do you have the original sketches? In my studio, but I can't go back there. The penthouse is his property. Then we find another way in. Blake looked up, something sharp in his eyes. Victoria, this case isn't just about money or divorce. Your husband committed fraud, identity theft, possibly embezzlement. We're not just fighting for your inheritance. We're potentially putting him in prison. The weight of that hit me. Prison. Garrett in an orange jumpsuit instead of Armani. Part of me recoiled. Part of me whispered, good. I need you to understand something. Blake continued. The moment we file, this becomes war. He'll come at you with everything. Destroy your reputation further. Maybe try for custody of your baby. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the video, the 20 million people who'd watched me collapse, the comments calling me crazy, Madison's betrayal, the hospital room where Garrett didn't come. I'm already destroyed, I said. I've got nothing left to lose. Blake smiled, and it wasn't kind. It was the smile of someone who knew how to fight in the dark. Then let's burn his world down. He opened a file drawer, pulled out a digital recorder. Starting tomorrow, you're going to become very careful about every interaction. We need evidence. Real, admissible evidence. That means recordings where legal, detailed notes everywhere else. Think you can do that? I took the recorder, held it like a weapon. Yes. Good, because in about 6 hours, Garrett's going to realize you didn't sign those divorce papers. He's going to come looking for you, and when he does, we're going to be ready. Blake walked me upstairs to the guest room. It was small, like he'd said. A bed, a dresser, a window overlooking the Brooklyn street. But it was clean and safe and mine. Bathroom's down the hall, he said. Kitchen's communal. Help yourself to anything. Lock your door at night, not because of me, but because this neighborhood's not the Upper East Side. Thank you, I said. I don't know how to repay, but when, he interrupted. That's how you repay me. We take everything from him, and you walk away whole. Deal. I shook his hand. His grip was firm, steady, the first solid thing I'd felt in hours. After he left, I sat on the bed and finally let myself cry. Not the panicked sobs from earlier. Deep, shaking grief for the life I'd thought I had. The marriage I'd believed in. The man I'd loved who'd never actually existed. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. We need to talk. This doesn't have to get ugly. Call me. Gee. Garrett, already reaching out, already trying to control the narrative. I forwarded the text to Blake, then blocked the number. He could talk to my lawyer. I was done being his victim. Morning came with autumn light filtering through thin curtains. I woke to the smell of coffee and the sounds of Brooklyn stirring to life below. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then reality crashed back. Homeless, pregnant, fighting a man with infinite resources. But alive, still alive. I found Blake in the kitchen, reviewing documents. He'd clearly been up for hours. Coffee's decaf, he said without looking up. And there's oatmeal if you're hungry. You need to eat, baby needs fuel. I poured a mug, grateful. What's the plan today? Today, we make you disappear from his radar while we investigate. Blake slid a prepaid phone across the table. New number. Only give it to people you absolutely trust. Which, based on yesterday, might be nobody. Just you and Dr. Marsh, I said quietly. He nodded. I've got a private investigator coming at 10. Her name is Margaret Foster. She specializes in financial fraud. While she digs into Garrett's accounts, you and I are going to build your creative portfolio. Prove you designed everything he's claimed as his. The morning passed in focused work. Margaret Foster arrived exactly at 10, a sharp woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharper eyes. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes in precise shorthand. Offshore accounts in the Caymans, she said finally. That's ambitious. Usually takes years to unravel. But if he was sloppy with the forgeries, he might have been sloppy elsewhere. Can you find proof? Blake asked. I can find anything. Question is how fast you need it. Before she gives birth, Blake said. 10 weeks maximum. Margaret's eyebrows rose. Aggressive timeline. I'll need access to everything. Bank statements, company filings, her father's original will, marriage certificate, every document that exists. I spent the next hour providing everything I could access digitally. Margaret worked in silence, her laptop screen reflecting cascades of numbers and legal text. Around noon, my new phone buzzed. Dr. Marsh. Victoria, I need you to come in for a follow-up. After last night's stress, I want to check on the baby. Blake drove me to the hospital. In the waiting room, I felt exposed. Like everyone recognized me from the viral video, the pregnant woman whose husband publicly humiliated her. But nobody stared. Nobody whispered. In this Brooklyn clinic, I was just another patient. Dr. Marsh performed the ultrasound herself. The baby's heartbeat filled the small room, strong and steady. I watched the screen, that tiny, perfect form, and felt something solidify inside me. This child would not grow up with a criminal for a father. Everything looks good, Dr. Marsh said, but your blood pressure's still elevated. I'm prescribing bed rest for the next week. Minimal stress. I almost laughed. Minimal stress while fighting for my life. I'll make sure she rests, Blake said from the doorway. Marsh glanced between us. Mr. Sullivan, I'm glad Victoria has representation, but she also needs support. Legal battles during pregnancy are high risk. I understand. After the appointment, Blake drove us back to his office in silence. Finally, he said, she's right. This stress could hurt you or the baby. If you want to walk away, take a settlement and disappear, I'd understand. I thought about it, really considered it. $50,000. A quiet life somewhere far from Manhattan, raising my daughter in peace. Then I remembered Scarlett's smile, Garrett's mock sympathy, 20 million people laughing. No, I said. I want him destroyed. Blake nodded, satisfied. Then let's talk strategy. Margaret will take weeks to build the fraud case. Meanwhile, Garrett's going to escalate. He needs you to sign those divorce papers. The longer you don't, the more nervous he gets. Good. Let him sweat. Victoria, Blake's voice went serious. When powerful men get nervous, they get dangerous. I need you to promise me something. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't meet him without witnesses. Don't trust anyone from your old life. His intensity startled me. What do you think he'll do? I don't know, but men who commit fraud don't stop at fraud. They protect their interests. And right now, you're a threat to everything he built. That night back in the small guest room, I couldn't sleep. My mind spun through scenarios. Garrett showing up at the door, serving me with custody papers, planting evidence to prove I was unstable. Around 2 in the morning, I heard Blake's footsteps in the kitchen, found him at the table, surrounded by case files. Can't sleep either, I asked. He looked up, tired, thinking about my sister, wondering if I'd started fighting sooner. Would she still be here? I sat across from him. What happened? Blake was quiet for a long time. Then her name was Rachel. Married a guy who seemed perfect, successful businessman, charming. Within 2 years, he'd taken control of her finances, her business, her identity. When she finally tried to leave, he sued her for everything, claimed she was mentally ill, unstable. Sound familiar? My chest tightened. What did you do? I was in law school, didn't have resources to fight him. By the time I graduated, passed the bar, and could help, she'd already... He stopped. Pills. Whole bottle. Left a note saying she couldn't live with the shame. Blake, I'm so sorry. He met my eyes. I tell you this because I need you to understand. This fight isn't just about you. Every time I take down a man like Garrett, I'm avenging her. So yeah, I'm invested. Maybe too invested. If that makes you uncomfortable, say so now. I reached across the table, covered his hand with mine. It makes me feel less alone. For a moment, we just sat there. Two broken people in a Brooklyn kitchen, planning war against someone who thought we'd be easy to destroy. The next morning, Margaret Foster called with an update. I found something, shell company in Grand Cayman called Scarlet Enterprises. Guess who's listed as CEO? Scarlet Rose, I said. Close, Judith Hayes. Blake's head snapped up. His mother and son team. Margaret continued. Looks like they've been funneling money through Scarlet's modeling contracts for 2 years. Fake invoices for promotional work that never happened. I'm talking millions. Can we prove it? Blake asked. I can prove money moved. Proving it was fraudulent requires more digging. But Victoria, I need to ask something. Did you ever sign contracts for the company? Anything financial? I thought back. Garrett handled all that. Said it was boring business stuff I didn't need to worry about. Did you give him power of attorney? My stomach dropped. I don't remember. Maybe after my father died, everything was chaos. Garrett said he needed to protect the company during the transition. Blake swore softly. If you gave him power of attorney, he could have signed anything in your name legally. Is that bad? It means the forgeries might actually be legal forgeries. Margaret said, he could argue you authorized everything. The walls felt closer. Every revelation made the trap tighter. Wait, I said slowly. My father's will. It specifically stated I had to personally approve any ownership transfers. No power of attorney could override that. His lawyer made a huge deal about it at the reading. Blake straightened. Do you have a copy? My father's attorney does. Richard Sullivan. Blake blinked. Richard Sullivan, in any relation to my uncle, Blake said quietly. My mother's brother. I didn't know he handled your father's estate. The coincidence felt too large, too perfect. Call him, I said. Now, Blake pulled out his phone, dialed, put it on speaker. Uncle Richard, it's Blake. I need to ask you about a client. Richard Bennett. There was a long pause. Then Blake, that case is sealed. Client privacy. The client's daughter is sitting in my office. She's my client now, and her husband's been committing fraud using her inheritance. Another pause. Then Richard Sullivan's voice changed, became sharp and professional. Victoria Bennett is there. Yes, I said, Mr. Sullivan, I need to know what my father's will said about ownership transfers. It said no transfers without your physical presence and notarized signature. No exceptions. Your father was adamant. He didn't trust Garrett Hayes. The room went still. He didn't trust him, I repeated. Did he say why? Said Garrett reminded him of someone from his past, someone who'd stolen designs and claimed them as original work. Your father specifically wrote protections into the will to prevent that from happening to you. My father had known. Somehow he'd known what Garrett would become. Mr. Sullivan, Blake said, we need every document from that estate. Everything. Can you courier them today? I'll do better. I'll bring them myself. This bastard needs to answer for what he's done. After Blake hung up, he looked at me with something new in his eyes. Respect. Your father tried to protect you, he said. Now we finish what he started. For the first time since the gala, I felt something other than fear or rage. I felt hope. Richard Sullivan arrived at Blake's office like a storm in a suit. Mid-60s, gray hair, and eyes that had seen too many people lose everything to fraudulent contracts. He carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than I'd spent on groceries in a year. Victoria Bennett, he said, extending his hand. I should have reached out after your father died, checked on you, made sure you were protected. That's on me. You couldn't have known, I said. I knew enough. He opened the briefcase, pulled out a thick folder. Your father came to me 6 months before he died, said he needed to update his will, make it bulletproof against what he called inevitable betrayal. I thought he was being paranoid. I was wrong. Blake took the folder, started reading. His expression darkened with each page. This is airtight, he said. Victoria had to personally appear before a notary for any ownership transfer. And there's a clause here. If anyone attempted to forge her signature or coerce transfer, the entire estate reverts solely to her. Garrett would get nothing. I stared at the document. My father knew. He knew what Garrett would try. Richard nodded. Your father was a brilliant designer, but an even better judge of character. He told me Garrett reminded him of someone from his early career, a partner who'd stolen designs, filed them under his own name. Your father barely survived that betrayal. He wasn't going to let it happen to you. But it did happen, I said. Garrett took everything. He tried, Richard corrected. But if we can prove those transfers were forged or coerced, the original will stand. Everything reverts to you. Bennett Designs, Hayes Luxury Atelier, all of it. Blake was already pulling up documents on his laptop. Margaret's been tracking the financial transfers. If we can match dates between the ownership changes and the offshore accounts, we can prove motive. For hours, the three of us worked, building a timeline, cross-referencing signatures, finding patterns in the case. Around 6 in the evening, Margaret Foster called again. I found something big, she said, and her voice had that edge investigators get when they know they've hit gold. Judith Hayes, Garrett's mother, transferred $2.3 million from her personal account to Scarlet Enterprises 3 days before the gala. The memo line says final payment. Final payment for what? I asked. That's what we need to find out. But Victoria, I pulled Judith's financial records. She's been systematically selling off her late husband's assets. Real estate, stocks, everything. And it's all going to shell companies connected to Garrett. Blake's jaw tightened. Elder fraud. He's stealing from his own mother. Or she's complicit, Margaret said. Either way, this adds another charge. Federal investigators love elder fraud cases. It's guaranteed prison time. Richard Sullivan leaned back in his chair, a grim smile on his face. Victoria, your husband didn't just betray you. He's been running a criminal enterprise. The question is, do we go to the authorities now or build a stronger case first? Stronger case, Blake said immediately. If we move too fast, Garrett lawyers up and we lose momentum. We need everything documented, airtight, irrefutable. How long? I asked. Another month, maybe 6 weeks. Margaret needs to trace every dollar. Richard needs to depose witnesses. I need to prepare for the custody battle that's coming. Custody battle. The words hit like ice water. He's going to try to take my baby, I whispered. Yes, Blake said, not sugarcoating it. And he'll use every dirty trick. Claim you're unstable, unfit, that the pregnancy was a manipulation tactic. We need to be ready. That night, after Richard and Margaret left, I sat in the small nest room, feeling the baby move inside me. Strong kicks. Determined. Like she knew we were fighting for both our futures. Blake knocked softly. Can I come in? Yeah. He entered carrying 2 mugs of tea, handed me one. I know today was overwhelming. Multiple conspiracies, criminal charges, custody threats. But Victoria, we're close. Closer than most fraud cases get in months. Your father's will is the key. It proves Garrett never had legal right to anything. What happens when we file? I asked. He'll retaliate, probably claim you forged your own father's will, accuse us of elder fraud against Judith. It'll get ugly. Uglier than a viral video of my humiliation. Blake smiled sluggishly. Fair point, but there's something else. I received a call this afternoon from a reporter at the New York Times. Someone leaked them a story about Hayes Luxury Atelier's financial irregularities. They want to interview you. My heart rate spiked. Someone leaked who? Don't know, oh. But the reporter, her name is Elizabeth Warren. She's legit. Won a Pulitzer for corporate fraud investigation. If she's sniffing around Garrett, it means others are too. Should I talk to her? Not yet. Let her investigate independently. When we file our case, her story drops simultaneously. Maximum impact. I sipped the tea, thinking, Blake, what if we lose? What if Garrett's lawyers are better than us? He was quiet for a moment. I've never lied to a client. Won't start now. We might lose. Garrett has resources, connections, power, but he's arrogant. Arrogant people make mistakes, and we only need him to make one. Over the next 3 weeks, I lived in that Brooklyn guest room like a ghost. Blake brought me meals. Margaret sent daily updates. Richard Sullivan lined up expert witnesses. I spent the time documenting everything. Every design I'd created. Every conversation I could remember. Every email, text, photo, sketch. Building a case brick by brick. Doctor, Marsh visited twice a week, monitoring the pregnancy. You're holding up remarkably well, she said during one visit. Most women under this stress would have delivered early. She's stubborn, I said, hand on my belly. Like her mother, but the isolation was crushing. No friends, no family, just me and a team of lawyers preparing for war. Then, 4 weeks after the gala, my new phone rang. Unknown number. Don't answer, Blake said immediately, but something made me pick up. Hello, Victoria, Garrett's voice, smooth, controlled. We need to talk, in person. No, I'm standing outside your lawyer's office. Come down, 5 minutes. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to offer you a better deal. I looked at Blake. He shook his head firmly, but curiosity gnawed at me. What could he possibly offer that would make this better? I'll come down. I said, but Blake comes with me, boom. Fine, 5 minutes. Blake grabbed his phone, started recording. If we're doing this, we're documenting everything. We went downstairs. Garrett stood on the sidewalk, looking perfect as always. Expensive suit, perfect hair, the mask of a man who'd never done anything wrong. Victoria, he said, and his voice held something I'd never heard before. Uncertainty. You look well. What do you want, Garrett? He glanced at Blake, then back to me. I want to settle this quietly. No lawyers, no press, no ugliness. I'll give you $2 million. Full custody of the baby. You disappear. Never speak to media. Never contest the company ownership. $2 million. Enough to raise my daughter comfortably forever. Why hadn't I asked? Why the sudden generosity? His mask slipped. Just for a second, I saw fear. Because if this goes to court, things will come out. Things that hurt both of us. Your father's company had debts you don't know about. Obligations I covered personally. If we start digging, we both get buried. It was the first time he'd admitted knowing the truth might destroy him. I'll think about it, I said. Relief flooded his face. Good, that's good. You have my number. Call me when you're ready to. I'm ready now, Defano. I interrupted. My answer is no. The relief vanished. Victoria, don't be stupid. $2 million. Isn't enough. Isn't even close. You took $50 million from me, destroyed my reputation, humiliated me in front of the world. $2 million is an insult. His expression went cold. You'll regret this. Maybe, but I'll regret it on my terms, not yours. Blake stepped between us. This conversation is over. Don't contact my client again. We turned and walked back inside. My hands were shaking, but my voice had been steady. That was dangerous, Blake said once we were back upstairs. He could have. I needed to see his face, see if he was scared. I looked at Blake. He's terrified, which means we're close. Blake played back the recording. Garrett's voice admitting to covering debts, offering hush money, all of it captured clearly. He just handed us motive, Blake said, something like admiration in his voice. Victoria, you just got him to confess on tape. I allowed myself a small smile. My father always said the best way to catch someone in a lie is to make them feel safe first. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks because I just learned something important. Garrett was scared of me, and scared men make mistakes. 6 weeks after the gala, I walked into Manhattan Family Court 8.5 months pregnant, wearing a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, just a woman fighting for her child. Garrett sat at the plaintiff's table with the 3 attorneys. He'd filed for emergency custody, claiming I was mentally unfit and a flight risk. He didn't know what we'd prepared. Judge Philip Lancaster presided, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and a reputation for conservative rulings. Blake had warned me about him. Lancaster's old guard. He'll favor the husband by default unless we give him no choice. Garrett's lead attorney, Sarah Bennett, stood first. Your Honor, my client seeks temporary custody due to serious concerns about the mother's mental stability. Mrs. Hayes has a documented history of emotional instability. She collapsed at a public event, has refused psychiatric evaluation, and is currently living in an undisclosed location. Judge Lancaster looked at me. Mrs. Hayes, is this true? Blake stood. Your Honor, my client is Ms. Bennett. She's reclaimed her maiden name, and these accusations are fabrications designed to strip her of parental rights. Do you have evidence to counter? Blake opened his briefcase. This is a medical report from Dr. Caroline Marsh, an OB/GYN with 20 years experience. Her professional opinion states, quote, patient shows no signs of mental instability. Collapse was acute stress response to psychological trauma. Patient is fully capable of parenting. Sarah Bennett barely glanced at it. One doctor's opinion doesn't outweigh concerning behavior patterns. Mr. Hayes can provide testimony from multiple sources. What happened next was character assassination. Garrett testified about my mood swings, my isolation, how I'd become obsessed with the baby. I tried to get her help, he said, voice heavy with false concern. But she refused. Your Honor, I love my wife, but I fear for my child's safety. Next came Madison Cole, my former best friend. She testified about my paranoia, how I'd accused her of betrayal without cause. Victoria changed, Madison said, dabbing fake tears. She became someone I didn't recognize. Angry, suspicious. By the time they finished, I looked like a textbook case of prenatal psychosis. Judge Lancaster turned to me. Ms. Bennett, do you have a response? I stuttered slowly. Your Honor, may I ask Mr. Hayes a question? Lancaster frowned. This is irregular, but go ahead. I looked directly at Garrett. When did you file for divorce? He blinked, caught off guard. What is that? What date did you file the divorce papers? His attorney started to object, but Lancaster waved her off. Answer, Mr. Hayes. 3 weeks ago, Garrett said. That's odd, I said calmly, because I have the papers you served me in the hospital. They're dated the morning of the gala, before you humiliated me in public, which means you filed for divorce before I allegedly became unstable. So which is it? Was I unstable when you married me, or did you invent this narrative? The courtroom went silent. Garrett's face flushed. I meant I filed the final papers. You filed them the morning you destroyed me, I said, then sent them to me in a hospital bed while I was fighting to save our baby. That's not concern. That's cruelty. Blake stood, handing another document to the judge. Your Honor, this is a recording of a conversation between Ms. Bennett and Mr. Hayes 4 weeks ago. In it, he offers her $2 million to disappear and never contest custody. That doesn't sound like a term worried about his wife's mental health. Lancaster listened to the recording, his expression darkening. Sarah Bennett scrambled. That recording was obtained without Mr. Hayes' knowledge. It's inadmissible. New York is a one-party consent state, Blake countered. The recording is completely legal. Judge Lancaster leaned back. Mr. Hayes, I'm troubled by this timeline. You file for divorce, publicly humiliate your wife, offer her money to disappear, then claim you're acting in her best interest. Your Honor, I can explain. Motion for emergency custody denied. Ms. Bennett retains full parental rights. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down. For one perfect moment, I'd won. Then Sarah Bennett stood. Your Honor, one more thing. We'd like to submit evidence that Ms. Bennett has been accessing confidential company files without authorization. We're prepared to file criminal charges for corporate espionage. My blood went cold. Blake's expression didn't change. Your Honor, Ms. Bennett is a 50% owner of Bennett Designs per her father's will. When she forfeited that ownership in the prenuptial agreement, Sarah shot back, pulling out a document. Signed 3 days before the wedding, she handed it to the judge. My signature was on the page, but I'd never seen that document before. Your Honor, Blake said quickly. We'd like time to authenticate this document. Lancaster studied it. It looks authentic to me. Miss Bennett, did you sign this? I opened my mouth, closed it. I don't remember signing it. You don't remember, Sarah repeated, tone sharp. Your Honor, this supports our claims of mental instability. The trap was perfect. If I claimed forgery, I looked paranoid. If I admitted signing it, I lost everything. Judge Lancaster rubbed his temples. This case is becoming more complicated. I'm ordering a full forensic evaluation of all documents related to Bennett Design's ownership. Ms. Bennett, you're not to access any company files. Violation will result in criminal charges. We reconvene in 30 days. Another gavel strike. This time, I'd lost. Outside the courthouse, Blake was furious. That prenup is fake. We'll prove it. How they have my signature? He grabbed my shoulders gently. Because your father's will supersedes any prenup. It explicitly states you cannot waive ownership rights. That document is legally meaningless even if you did sign it. Time for what? To move assets offshore. Blake pulled out his phone, called Margaret. Get every account frozen now. But Margaret's response made his face fall. What do you mean it's already gone? Garrett had moved the money, all of it, at the office. Margaret was waiting with printouts. He emptied every account this morning. Right after the hearing started, Hayes Luxury Atelier is a shell. Bennett Design's assets were transferred to 17 different offshore companies. The only thing left is debt. How much debt? I whispered. $47 million. My knees buckled. Blake caught me. He planned this, I said numbly. Every move, all of it was theater while he stole everything. Blake knelt in front of me. Victoria, he made a mistake. Moving that much money that fast leaves a trail. We can use this. Use it how? He's untouchable. No one's untouchable. We bring in the FBI. Make this bigger than a civil case. Margaret nodded. I've already contacted Financial Crimes Enforcement. They're interested. How long? I asked. Months. I looked down at my belly. I don't have months. There's another way, Margaret said slowly. Riskier, but faster. She pulled up a photo of Scarlet Rose at a nightclub, looking drunk and sloppy. Scarlet's falling apart. Garrett dumped her. If we approach her right, she might flip. Why would she help me? Margaret smiled grimly. Because revenge is a universal language, and right now, she wants it as badly as you do. I looked at the photo. Scarlet Rose, the woman who destroyed my life, now broken and discarded. Set up a meeting, I said. Let's see if the enemy of my enemy really is my friend. We met Scarlet Rose in a 24-hour diner in Queens at 2 in the morning. Blake insisted on the location, somewhere public but anonymous, where Garrett's surveillance wouldn't follow. She looked nothing like the goddess from the gala. No makeup, hoodie and jeans, hair in a messy bun. Her eyes were red-rimmed, either from crying or substances. Maybe both. I slid into the booth across from her, Blake beside me. Margaret watched from a nearby table, recording everything. You came, Scarlett said, voice hoarse. I honestly didn't think you would. I'm here. Talk. She laughed bitterly. Garrett Hayes is a sociopath who uses people like tissues and throws them away when they're done. Welcome to the club, I said. Population us. Scarlett looked at my belly. When are you due? 2 weeks? Maybe less. Something crossed her face. Regret, guilt. I'm sorry. For what I did at the gala. He told me you were abusive, that you'd trapped him with the pregnancy. I was stupid enough to think I was special. She pulled out her phone, showed me text messages. This is what he sent me 2 days ago. The message read, you served your purpose. Lose my number. Blake leaned forward. Scarlett, what arrangement did you have with Garrett? She took a shaky breath. He paid me $150,000 to seduce him publicly, humiliate Victoria at the gala, and testify in court that she was unstable. All of it was scripted. My hands clenched into fists. You were paid to ruin my life. Yes, and I'm telling you now because he's doing the same thing to someone else. There's another woman. He introduced her yesterday as the new creative director. I'm being erased just like you were. Blake pulled out a legal pad. I need names, dates, amounts, every detail. For the next hour, Scarlett talked. How Garrett had approached her 2 years ago. How the plan to destroy me had been laid out months in advance. Did you know about the fraud? Blake asked. The stolen inheritance, the offshore accounts. Scarlett hesitated. I knew some of it. He had me sign documents for shell companies. I was listed as CEO of Scarlett Enterprises, but I never actually ran anything. He used my name to hide money. She pulled out a USB drive. Bank statements, contracts, emails, everything from the last 2 years. Blake took the drive carefully. This evidence could put Garrett in federal prison, but it also implicates you. You'd have to testify, probably face charges yourself. I know. That's why I want immunity. I can't promise that. Only prosecutors can. Then get me prosecutors, because I'm done being his victim. Blake made calls for the next 3 days, negotiating with federal prosecutors. They were interested but wanted more evidence before offering immunity. Meanwhile, I went into labor. It started at 4 in the morning. Sharp pains that woke me from restless sleep. Blake drove me to the hospital. Dr. Marsh met us at the entrance. Right on time, she said. Let's have a baby. 16 hours later, my daughter was born. 6 pounds, 8 ounces, perfect tiny fingers. A cry that sounded like pure determination. I named her Hope. Blake visited that night, bringing flowers. She's beautiful. Looks just like you. Thank God she doesn't look like her father. He smiled, but it faded quickly. Garrett filed an emergency motion for DNA testing. He's claiming the baby might not be his. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. Let him test. She's his, unfortunately. There's more. He's also filed for full custody, claiming you're unfit due to postpartum complications. I looked down at Hope sleeping in my arms. He's never even met her, and he wants to take her from me. He wants leverage. The custody hearing is in 2 weeks, and Dr. Marsh appeared in the doorway. Victoria, I need to tell you something. A man claiming to be your husband tried to enter the maternity ward an hour ago. Security stopped him. He said he'd be back with a court order. My blood went cold. Garrett's here. Blake's jaw tightened. He can't just take her. There are legal procedures. He's got Judge Lancaster in his pocket, Margaret said, joining us. I've been digging into Lancaster's finances. Guess who donated $50,000 to his re-election campaign last year? Garrett and his mother. Judith Hayes, another $50,000. Blake stood. We need to go over Lancaster's head, file an ethics complaint. That takes weeks, Margaret countered. We've got 2 weeks before the custody hearing. Then we move faster. Scarlett's testimony, the financial records, everything. We dump it all on the prosecutors and force them to act now. I held Hope closer. Do whatever it takes. Just keep her safe. That night, alone in the hospital room, I made a decision. I called Blake. I need you to research something. Islands without extradition treaties. Silence on the other end. Then, Victoria, if you run, you lose everything. The case, the company, any chance at justice. I don't care about justice anymore. I care about her. Running makes you look guilty. Think about this. I thought about it. Thought about life on the run with the newborn. Thought about Hope growing up knowing her mother was a fugitive. You're right, I said finally. But Blake, if we lose the custody hearing, I need to know I have options. You'll have options, legal ones, I promise. 2 days later, hospital social services visited. A woman named Anna Campbell with kind eyes and a clipboard performed a wellness check, asked questions about my support system, my housing, my plans. After she left, Dr. Marsh came in. Victoria, Anna's report goes directly to family court. Whatever she writes will influence Judge Lancaster's decision. What do you think she'll write? That you're isolated, living in temporary housing, with no family support. Garrett's lawyers will use that against you. Dr. Marsh, can you document every time Garrett's tried to see Hope, every visit he hasn't made? She understood immediately, building a pattern of parental abandonment. Smart. Yes, I can document that. On discharge day, Blake arrived with a car seat. The Brooklyn brownstone felt different with a newborn. Fuller, louder. He'd set up a crib and changing table in the guest room. "You didn't have to do this," I said. "Yes, I did. She deserves a real nursery." Margaret visited that evening with updates. Prosecutors are moving forward with the fraud case. Scarlett's testimony plus the financial records are enough for an indictment. Grand jury in 3 weeks. And the custody hearing, I asked? 2 weeks, before the indictment. Lancaster won't delay it. But Blake paced the kitchen. "We need something that forces his hand, something that makes him recuse himself." "Like what?" I asked. He stopped pacing. "Like proof Lancaster's actively conspiring with Garrett. If we can show direct communication between them about this case, it's grounds for immediate recusal." "How do we prove that?" Margaret asked. Blake smiled grimly. "We make Garrett think he's won, make him feel safe enough to be careless." He explained the plan. It was risky, possibly illegal, definitely desperate. But desperate was all we had left. "Let's do it," I said, because in 2 weeks, I'd either have my daughter safe in my arms or I'd lose everything trying. The plan was simple in theory, terrifying in execution. Blake had discovered that Garrett and Judge Lancaster occasionally had lunch at the same private club in Manhattan. White tablecloths. Old money. The kind of place where deals were made over scotch and handshakes. If we could record them discussing the custody case, we'd have evidence of judicial misconduct. "It's risky," Blake warned for the 10th time. "If you get caught wearing a wire in that club, Garrett could have you arrested for harassment." "Then I won't get caught," I said. Margaret had procured a tiny recording device, barely larger than a button, that could be sewn into clothing. I wore a simple dress, professional and forgettable, with the recorder hidden beneath the collar. The club didn't allow non-members past the lobby, but Margaret had made friends with a server who agreed to leave a side door unlocked for 20 minutes during the lunch rush. I entered through the kitchen, heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it, kept my head down, moved like I belonged there. Garrett and Judge Lancaster sat in a corner booth, secluded enough for privacy but not so hidden that I couldn't get close. I slipped into the booth directly behind them, separated only by a tall leather divider, ordered tea I wouldn't drink, and listened. "Worried about the fraud investigation," Garrett was saying. "If they freeze assets before the custody hearing, I lose leverage." Lancaster's voice was smooth, unconcerned. "I'll rule in your favor regardless. The Bennett woman has no support system, no stable housing, easy case, and the prenup issue, her lawyers are claiming my father's will supersedes it. I'll dismiss that argument. The prenup is valid as far as my court is concerned, even though it contradicts a state law." A pause. Then Lancaster laughed. "Garrett, you donated $100,000 to my re-election campaign. I think I can interpret a state law however I want." My hand trembled around the teacup. He just admitted to corruption. On tape. "What about the fraud charges?" Garrett continued. "If I'm indicted before the custody hearing, then we move the hearing up. I'll expedite it. Give you emergency custody based on the mother's instability. By the time any criminal trial starts, the child will be legally yours. Much harder for them to undo custody after it's established. You can do that. Move up a court date. I'm the judge. I can do whatever I want." They continued talking, discussing strategy like they were planning a golf game. Every word was damning. Every sentence proved conspiracy. I sat frozen, barely breathing, recording everything. Then Garrett said something that made my blood turn to ice. "What about the baby DNA test came back? She's mine. 99.9%. Good. That eliminates one argument. Though I have to say that child would be better off with anyone other than her mother." Lancaster said it so casually, like Hope's entire future was just a minor inconvenience. "Once I have custody," Garrett said, "I'm sending her to boarding school in Switzerland. My mother will handle the early years. I don't have time for an infant." He was going to ship Hope overseas. Give her to his mother. Erase me completely. I must have made a sound. A gasp or a whimper. Garrett's voice sharpened. "Did you hear something?" "Just kitchen noise." Lancaster said, "You're paranoid." "With good reason. Victoria's lawyer is competent. More competent than I expected." Blake Sullivan, he's a Brooklyn nobody. Small-time practice, no real resources. He'll fold when we push hard enough. I wanted to stand up, scream at them, tell them exactly what I thought of their conspiracy, but I stayed silent, kept recording. They finished lunch 20 minutes later. I waited until they left before moving, my legs shaky as I stood, made it back through the kitchen, out the side door, into the Manhattan afternoon. Blake and Margaret were waiting 2 blocks away in a parked car. "Did you get it?" Blake asked immediately. I handed him the recorder with trembling hands. Everything. Corruption. Conspiracy. Plans to send Hope to Switzerland. All of it. They listened to the recording in the car. Blake's expression grew darker with every word. "This is it," he said finally. "This is everything we need. Lancaster's done. Garrett's done. What do we do with it?" I asked. "First, we make copies, multiple copies, stored in different locations. Then we file an emergency motion to recuse Lancaster from the case. Citing judicial misconduct, we include the recording as evidence. When? Tomorrow morning, before he can move it up the custody hearing." That night, back at Blake's office, we prepared the motion. Margaret handled the technical aspects, authenticating the recording, verifying voices, establishing chain of custody. Blake wrote the legal brief. Sharp, precise, devastating. I fed Hope and tried not to think about what would happen if this didn't work. Around midnight, Blake's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered on speaker. "Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, this is Richard Sullivan calling from the New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct." Blake straightened. "Uncle Richard, why are you calling from the commission?" "Because I sit on the ethics panel, and I just received an interesting voicemail. Someone sent us a recording of Judge Lancaster discussing a case while taking bribes. The recording was anonymous, but the voice of the woman who delivered it sounded remarkably like your client." My stomach dropped. We hadn't filed the motion yet. How did the commission already know Uncle Richard? I can explain. Don't. I'm calling to tell you that as of 1 hour ago, Judge Lancaster has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. He's been removed from all cases, including Hayes versus Bennett. A new judge will be assigned within 48 hours. Blake and I locked eyes. Someone had leaked the recording before we could file it officially. "Who sent you the recording?" Blake asked. "Like I said, anonymous. But between you and me, sometimes justice moves faster when good people break a few rules. The new judge will be assigned tomorrow. Expect a fair hearing." He hung up. Margaret was already pulling up information on her laptop. "I didn't send it. Did you buy him?" "No," Blake said. "Victoria." "No." "Then who?" We sat in confused silence until Blake's phone rang again. This time, a voice I recognized. Dr. Marsh. "Victoria, I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of sending that recording to a few people. The Judicial Conduct Commission, the FBI, and the New York Times. Sometimes doctors have to do more than heal bodies. Sometimes we have to heal justice." I almost laughed. "Dr. Marsh, you could lose your license for that. They'd have to prove I did it, and I'm very good at not leaving evidence." She paused. "That man was going to take your daughter and send her to another country. I couldn't stand by and let that happen." After she hung up, the three of us sat in stunned silence. "We have the strangest allies," Margaret finally said. Blake smiled. "The best kind. People who believe justice matters more than rules." The next morning, every news outlet in New York ran the same story. Judge Lancaster suspended amid corruption scandal. Audio recording reveals conspiracy with CEO and custody case. The recording had been leaked in full. Every word, every damning sentence. By noon, Lancaster had resigned. By evening, the FBI had opened a formal investigation into both him and Garrett. And 48 hours later, a new judge was assigned to our case. Judge Patricia Winters, female, 50-something, known for being tough but fair. Blake submitted our evidence. The recording, the financial documents, Scarlett's testimony, everything we'd built over months. Judge Winters scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week. "This time," Blake said, "we end it." But Garrett Hayes wasn't finished yet. 3 days before the hearing, I received a package at Blake's office. No return address. Inside was a photo of Hope sleeping in her crib, taken from outside the window. And a note in Garrett's handwriting, "Custody hearing won't matter if you're not around to attend it." I stared at the photo until Blake gently took it from my shaking hands. "He's threatening you, Terry," Margaret said, voice tight with fury. "This is a witness intimidation. We can file charges." "Filing charges takes time," I said. "The hearing's in 3 days. He's trying to scare me into not showing up." Blake was already on the phone with someone. "Yes, Officer Davis, I need to report a threat. Possible stalking. Can you send someone to this address?" 2 uniformed police officers arrived within 30 minutes. They took statements, documented the photo and note, but their expressions said what they didn't. Without direct proof, Garrett sent it. There wasn't much they could do. "We can increase patrols in this area," Officer Brennan said. "And I'd recommend installing security cameras, changing your routine, maybe staying somewhere else temporarily." "I can't keep running," I said. "That's what he wants." After the officers left, Blake made a decision. "You and Hope are staying at my place until the hearing. My building has security cameras. Margaret, can you stay too?" "Extra eyes?" "Already planning on it." That night, the 3 of us took shifts watching over Hope. Every car that drove past made us tense. Every shadow felt like a threat. I sat in the small guest room, holding my sleeping daughter, and wondered how my life had become a thriller where the villain held all the cards. My phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. "Give up the case and I'll give up the chase. Your choice." I blocked the number. 10 minutes later, another text from a different number. "You can't protect her forever. I have resources you can't imagine." Block. Another text. "Be smart, Victoria. This doesn't end well for you." Blake took the phone from me. "He's trying to break you mentally before the hearing. Classic intimidation tactic." "It's working." "No, it's not. You're still here, still fighting. That's what matters." But fear was exhausting. Every noise made me jump. Every moment, Hope was out of my sight. Panic set in. Margaret suggested something radical. "What if we go on offense, stop reacting and start acting?" You're lying." "How?" Blake asked. "We release everything to the press. The recording, the financial fraud, Scarlett's testimony, all of it. Public pressure might force Garrett to back down. Or it might make him more desperate." I said. "He's already desperate. The question is whether we use that desperation against him." Blake considered it. "If we go public now, we lose the element of surprise in court. Garrett's lawyers will have time to prepare counter-arguments. But we gain public sympathy," Margaret countered. "And judges are influenced by public opinion, even when they claim they're not." We debated for hours. Finally, I made the decision. "Release it, all of it. I'm tired of hiding." Margaret contacted Elizabeth Warren at the New York Times, the investigative journalist who'd been sniffing around Garrett's finances for weeks. "I can have a story ready in 24 hours, Elizabeth said over speakerphone. "But I need on-the-record quotes from you, Victoria, and I need to verify the evidence independently." "Do it," I said. "Whatever you need." The next day, I sat for a 3-hour interview with Elizabeth Warren, told her everything: the gala humiliation, the stolen inheritance, the conspiracy with Judge Lancaster, Garrett's threats. She recorded every word, her expression growing more intense as the story unfolded. "This is bigger than I thought," she said finally. "This isn't just corporate fraud. This is systematic abuse of power, judicial corruption, and organized financial crime. Victoria, when this story runs, you'll be in the center of a media firestorm. I'm already in a firestorm. At least this time, I control the narrative." The article posted online at 6 in the morning, 2 days before the custody hearing. The headline: "Manhattan CEO's Empire Built on Fraud, Abuse, and Corruption, the Victoria Bennett Story." Within an hour, it had gone viral. Within 3 hours, every major news network was covering it. By afternoon, protesters had gathered outside Hayes Luxury Atelier headquarters. The video from the gala resurfaced, but this time with context. Suddenly, I wasn't the crazy woman having a breakdown. I was the victim of a calculated public humiliation. Social media exploded. #justice for Victoria trended worldwide. Garrett's Instagram was flooded with comments. Companies began severing ties with Hayes' luxury atelier. And that evening, federal agents arrested Garrett Hayes on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. I watched the news coverage from Blake's office, hope sleeping against my chest, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. "It's not over," Blake warned. "He'll make bail. He'll still show up at the custody hearing, but this changes everything. No judge will rule in his favor now, not with federal charges pending." The custody hearing 2 days later was almost anticlimactic. Judge Winters had clearly read the New York Times article. Her expression when Garrett entered the courtroom was pure contempt. His lawyers argued that the charges were false, that Victoria had orchestrated a media campaign to destroy him, that he was the real victim. Judge Winters let them speak for exactly 5 minutes before interrupting. "I've reviewed all evidence in this case," she said. "The financial documents, the recordings, witness testimony. Mr. Hayes, I find your claims of victimhood absurd given the overwhelming evidence of fraud and manipulation." Garrett's lead attorney tried to object. Judge Winters silenced her with a look. "Furthermore, the fact that you are currently under federal indictment for crimes directly related to the assets in dispute makes this custody case straightforward. Miss Bennett retains full custody of the minor child. Mr. Hayes, you are granted supervised visitation only, pending resolution of your criminal case. If convicted, this court will revisit custody with the expectation of terminating your parental rights entirely." The gavel came down. I had won. Garrett stood abruptly, face red with rage. "This is a farce. You're letting her destroy me because of lies." "Mr. Hayes," Judge Winters said coldly, "I suggest you save your arguments for your criminal trial. This hearing is adjourned." Security escorted him out as he shouted threats, but they were empty now, powerless. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Questions flew from every direction. Blake stepped in front of me. "Miss Bennett has no comment at this time. Please respect her privacy." But I stopped him, stepped forward, looked directly into the cameras. "I want to say something to every woman watching who's been told she's crazy, unstable, or too emotional. To everyone who's had their work stolen, their identity erased, their voice silenced. You are not alone, and you are not powerless. Thank you." Short, simple, honest. The clip played on every news network that night. Back at Blake's office, Margaret brought champagne. "To victory," she said, raising a glass. "To justice," Blake corrected. I didn't drink, just held hope and felt the weight of months of fear finally lifting. But late that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood by the window watching Brooklyn sleep. Victory felt hollow. Yes, I'd won custody. Yes, Garrett faced federal charges. Yes, the truth was public, but I was still living in someone else's guest room with a newborn and no career. My father's company was buried in debt. My reputation was synonymous with the scandal. Winning felt like surviving, and survival wasn't the same as living. Blake appeared in the doorway. "Can't sleep. Thinking about what comes next. Next is rebuilding, taking back your father's company, clearing the debt, creating something new." With what money, Garrett emptied everything. Not everything. Margaret found assets he missed, smaller accounts, investments your father made that were never transferred to company holdings, maybe 200,000 total. Not a fortune, but enough to start. 200,000, my father's emergency fund, the one thing Garrett hadn't found. "Start what?" I asked. Blake smiled. "Whatever you want. Fashion design, consulting, maybe something completely new." I looked down at Hope, her tiny face peaceful in sleep. "I want to build something she can be proud of," I said. "Something honest. Then we start tomorrow." But tomorrow brought something we didn't expect. A knock on the door at 7 in the morning. Blake answered it to find Scarlett Rose standing there, looking nervous. "I'm sorry to just show up," she said, "but I thought Victoria should know. Garrett made bail last night, and I heard him talking to his mother on the phone. He's not accepting this. He said, and I quote, 'If I go down, everyone goes down with me.'" My blood went cold. "What does that mean?" Scarlett met my eyes. I think it means he's planning something. Something final. We spent the next 24 hours in lockdown mode. Blake contacted the FBI agents handling Garrett's case. They assigned protection, but warned that until Garrett made an overt move, their hands were tied. He's out on bail, Agent Morrison explained. He's allowed to move freely as long as he doesn't violate bail conditions. Making vague threats isn't enough for us to revoke it. So we just wait for him to do something terrible, I asked. We monitor him closely. If he approaches you or the baby, he violates the restraining order. Then we act. It wasn't enough, but it was all we had. Margaret tracked Garrett's movements through his credit cards and phone records. He was staying at his mother's estate in Connecticut, 40 miles from Manhattan. He hasn't left the property in 2 days, she reported. Either he's laying low or planning something. Scarlett stayed with us, too nervous to go back to her own apartment. He blames me for everything, she said. For talking to you, for the FBI investigation, all of it. If he's planning revenge, I'm on the list too. The night was tense. Every car that passed felt suspicious. Every phone notification made us jump. Around midnight, Blake's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered on speaker. Mr. Sullivan, a woman's voice, older, refined. This is Judith Hayes, Garrett's mother. I need to speak with Victoria Bennett. It's urgent. Blake and I exchanged glances. Why had the boss? He asked. Because my son is planning something catastrophic, and I can't stop him. But maybe you can. Against Blake's better judgment, we agreed to meet. Neutral location, public place, multiple witnesses, a coffee shop that stayed open 24 hours. Judith Hayes looked nothing like I expected. She was elegant, mid-60s, with perfect posture and sad eyes. She sat across from us in the empty coffee shop, hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. I know you have no reason to trust me. You're right, I said. So why are we here? She took a breath. Because Garrett is planning to flee the country. He has accounts in Switzerland that the FBI hasn't found yet. Enough money to disappear permanently. And he's planning to take something with him that will destroy everyone involved in his prosecution. What? Blake demanded. Evidence. Real evidence that implicates all of you in fraud. He's been manufacturing documents for weeks. Forged emails showing you conspired with Victoria to frame him. False testimony from witnesses he's paid off. He's building a counter-narrative that makes everyone else the criminals. I felt sick. Can he actually do that? He can create enough reasonable doubt to avoid conviction, and he will, unless someone stops him. Why are you telling us this? Blake asked. You helped him commit fraud. You were part of the conspiracy. Judith's expression crumbled. Because I just found out what he plans to do with the child. The room went cold. He's not planning to send Hope to boarding school, she continued. He's planning to take her with him to Switzerland, raise her there under a new identity. You'd never see her again. Victoria, and her voice broke. I enabled him. I helped him become this monster because I thought I was protecting family legacy. But this is where I draw the line. Hope, he wanted to kidnap Hope. When I whispered, tomorrow night, he has a private plane chartered, leaves from a small airfield in Connecticut at 2 in the morning. He thinks no one's watching. Blake was already texting the FBI. We need to alert the agents now. They won't make it in time, Judith said. The airfield is in a jurisdiction gray area. By the time they get authorization to raid it, he'll be airborne. You need to stop him before he gets there. How? I demanded. How are we supposed to stop him? She slid a folder across the table. These are the real financial records. Every account, every transaction, every piece of evidence the FBI needs to freeze his assets globally. I've been documenting everything for months. Give this to the authorities and Garrett has nowhere to run. Blake opened the folder. Page after page of bank statements, transfer records, shell company documentation. It was comprehensive. Damning. Why now about, he asked. You've had this information for months. Why give it to us now? Because tonight I heard him on the phone. He wasn't planning to take me with him. After everything I've done, every law I've broken to protect him, he was going to abandon me here to face charges alone. She laughed bitterly. Turns out even mothers aren't safe from their monsters. Agent Morrison arrived 20 minutes later. Judith handed over the evidence and gave a full statement. By 3 in the morning, federal warrants were being issued. We'll have agents at the airfield by midnight tomorrow. Morrison said, if he shows up, we'll arrest him before he boards. And if he doesn't, I asked, then we track him until he surfaces. But Miss Bennett, with this evidence, he has no safe harbor. Every account is frozen. Every asset seized. He's a man without resources. Blake drove us back to his office as dawn broke over Brooklyn. None of us had slept. It's really over, Margaret said softly. This time it's actually over. But I couldn't celebrate yet. Not until Garrett was in custody. Not until Hope was permanently safe. The next day dragged. We stayed inside, doors locked, watching the clock. At 11 that night, Agent Morrison called. We're in position at the airfield. No sign of Hayes yet. We'll wait. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning. At 1:30, Morrison called again. He's here, arrived in a car with 2 large suitcases. We're moving in now. We listened over speakerphone as agents moved in, shouted commands. Garrett's voice protesting, then yelling, then nothing. Suspect in custody, Morrison reported. No flight risk anymore. He's going straight to federal detention until trial. I sat down heavily, the adrenaline draining all at once. It's done, Blake said quietly. He can't hurt you anymore. Scarlett was crying. Is it really over? For you, yes, you cooperated fully. Prosecutors will honor the immunity deal. She nodded, wiping tears. What will you do now? I looked at Hope sleeping peacefully in her carrier, unaware that she'd just been saved from kidnapping. I'm going to rebuild, I said. Everything he destroyed. I'm going to build back better. The trial took 6 months. Garrett Hayes was found guilty on 14 counts of fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison. Judith Hayes received 7 years for her role in the conspiracy. Judge Lancaster was disbarred and served 3 years for corruption. Scarlett's testimony was crucial to the prosecution. She walked away with immunity and started a new career as a victims' rights advocate. And me, I used my father's hidden accounts to pay off Bennett Designs' debt, restructured the company, started designing again, this time under my own name with full ownership. Hope turned 1 year old the week my first independent collection debuted at New York Fashion Week. The collection was called Stitched Together, inspired by everything I'd survived. Each piece featured visible repairs, torn fabric mended with gold thread, imperfections turned into art. The fashion world called it revolutionary. I called it honest. 18 months after the gala that destroyed my life, I stood backstage at New York Fashion Week with Hope on my hip. She was walking now, babbling in toddler language, reaching for everything with curious hands. The venue was smaller than the grand shows Garrett used to host. More intimate, more real. But the room was packed with buyers, editors, and celebrities who'd followed my story. Blake stood beside me, no longer just my attorney. Over the months of rebuilding Bennett Designs, he'd become creative director, business partner, and something more undefined but important. You ready? He asked, adjusting Hope's tiny dress. I've been ready for years. I just didn't know it. The show began with music I'd chosen carefully. Not triumphant orchestral pieces, but something quieter. Piano and strings that spoke of survival. Not victory. Models walked the runway in designs that told my story without words. The opening look was a white dress, deliberately torn at the shoulder, with silver threads stitching it back together. The same dress from the gala, reimagined. The audience gasped. They understood the reference immediately. Each subsequent piece explored transformation, damaged fabric repaired with precious metals, seams exposed instead of hidden, imperfection celebrated as strength. The final dress was worn by a model who'd also survived domestic violence. She walked the runway with her head high, wearing a gown that shifted from dark to light with every movement. At the end, she stopped, turned, and the back revealed a single word embroidered in gold, unbroken. The audience rose to their feet. Applause thundered through the venue. I walked onto the runway holding Hope, and the applause grew louder. Cameras flashed, but this time they felt like celebration, not weaponization. A reporter shouted from the crowd, "Victoria, what's next for Bennett Designs?" I thought about the question, about my father's legacy, about the woman I'd become through fire. Next is helping others rebuild. I said, we're launching a program to mentor women who've lost everything. Teach them design, business, survival. Because the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's becoming someone they could never break. The quote went viral within hours. By evening, my website had crashed from traffic. By morning, we'd received over 3,000 applications to the mentorship program. Margaret called, laughing. You broke the internet again, but this time in a good way. How's Scarlett doing? I asked. Good. Her advocacy work is taking it off. She's speaking at colleges about recognizing manipulation and financial abuse. She asked me to tell you thank you for giving her a chance at redemption. After the show, Blake, Hope, and I walked through Brooklyn as evening settled over the city, same streets where I'd hidden months ago, broken and desperate, but now they felt like home. Your father would be proud, Blake said quietly. I think he'd say I took too long to fight back. Maybe, or maybe he'd say you fought exactly when you were ready. We stopped at a small playground. Hope toddled toward the swings. Fearless, I watched her explore. This tiny person who'd been through so much without knowing it. Blake, I said, I've been thinking about the business, about what comes next. He turned to me, waiting. I want you to be a full partner, not just creative director, 50-50 ownership. Bennett and Sullivan Designs. His eyes widened. Victoria, you don't have to. I want to. You rebuilt me when I was shattered. This company exists because you believed in me when nobody else did. It should have your name too. For a moment, he looked overwhelmed. Then he smiled. Your father had one rule about business partnerships. Do you know what it was? Never partner with someone you wouldn't trust with your life. Close. Never partner with someone you wouldn't trust with your heart. Something shifted between us. All the careful professionalism, the boundaries we'd maintained, suddenly felt unnecessary. Blake, I said softly, what are we doing rebuilding? He said, together. He kissed me as the sun set over Brooklyn, Hope laughing on the swings nearby. And for the first time in years, the future felt less like surviving and more like living. 6 months later, Bennett and Sullivan Designs opened its first flagship store. The ribbon cutting was attended by every major fashion publication, but also by women from our mentorship program, survivors who'd rebuilt their lives alongside mine. I gave a speech that day, short, because I'd learned that impact doesn't require length. A year and a half ago, someone tried to erase me, stole my work, my identity, my dignity. He thought destroying me would be easy because I'd been taught to be quiet, taught to accept, taught that keeping peace was more important than demanding justice. I paused, looking at the crowd, at faces of women who'd survived similar battles. But here's what he didn't understand. You can tear someone's dress. You can steal their designs. You can humiliate them in front of millions. But you cannot break a woman who remembers who she was before you tried to destroy her. And you cannot stop a woman who decides she's done being a victim. The applause was deafening. But louder than applause was the sound of Hope calling Mama from Blake's arms. That night, after the crowds left and the store was quiet, I stood alone in the space my father had dreamed of. Bennett Designs had been his legacy. Now it was mine and Blake's. And one day, if she wanted it, it would be Hope's. My phone buzzed, an email notification from the federal prison system. Garrett had sent a message. After months of silence, he'd finally written. I almost deleted it unread. Then curiosity won. The message was short, you won. I hope it was worth it. I thought about responding, thought about telling him everything he'd cost me, everything I'd had to rebuild. Every night I'd cried, wondering if I'd survive. Instead, I wrote 2 words, it was. Then I blocked his email and deleted the message. Because giving him more of my attention, even in anger, gave him power he didn't deserve. Blake found me standing in the window, watching snow begin to fall over Manhattan. You okay? He asked. Better than okay, I said honestly. For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Where's that? I looked around the store, at designs that were truly mine, At a business built on honesty instead of theft. At a future I'd created from ashes. Home, I said simply. I'm finally home. He wrapped an arm around me as we watched the city lights reflect off fresh snow. Hope slept peacefully in her stroller, dreaming toddler dreams. And somewhere far away, in a federal prison, a man who'd thought he could destroy me learned what I'd always known. You can tear the dress, but you cannot tear the woman. Because some things, once broken and stitched back together, become stronger than they ever were whole. And I was living proof.